Paper crumpled in the boy's trembling hands as a red F glared at him like a scarlet brand, the kind teachers stamped when patience finally ran out. His jaw clenched, but the shame only grew heavier as whispers darted from locker to locker, like little daggers slicing into him. That's the billionaire's son? Can't even pass basic algebra. Beside him, pushing her mop bucket slowly across the polished floor, was the janitor, an older woman whose silence seemed louder than all the laughter. She glanced once at the boy, not with mockery, but with a knowing weight in her eyes. She had seen war carried in silence, seen defeat swallowed without complaint, seen men break and rise again. And though no one else noticed, she paused her mop for a fraction of a second, long enough to plant a seed of curiosity, long enough for him to feel, without words, that she carried a secret no grade could measure. It was the kind of moment that feels small at first, just a mop, just a boy, just a letter on a page. Yet it was about to unravel both of their lives. The boy who had everything except respect. Adrian Locke had grown up in castles of glass and steel. Limousines carried him to school, chefs sculpted meals he rarely finished, and his last name opened doors faster than his mind ever could. But wealth, he was learning, was a flimsy shield in a classroom. Teachers did not bow to bank accounts. Equations did not solve themselves with last names. His father, William Locke, built empires. Cold, precise, unstoppable, he prided himself on crushing competition before breakfast. But when it came to his only son, disappointment dripped from every word. "A Locke doesn't fail," he often said, his voice like a gavel. Adrian had heard it after every failed test, every underwhelming report card. The words weren't guidance, they were verdicts. Adrian's classmates saw him as a caricature, proof that money couldn't buy intelligence. Some mocked him openly, others snickered in corners. Few dared to see the boy inside the billionaire's shadow. A boy who studied late into the night, whose notebooks were filled with scribbles and tears, who tried and failed and tried again, only to collapse under the crushing silence of expectations unmet. And always, in the background, there was her, the janitor. She moved like a ghost through the hallways, pushing her mop, emptying bins, unnoticed. But Adrian noticed. Not at first, but slowly, in the quiet moments between failures. He noticed the way she carried herself, not bent by age or labor, but upright, steady, unshakable. Her name was Ruth. To most students, she was invisible. To some, she was the butt of cruel jokes whispered behind cupped hands. But her silence was not ignorance, it was armor. Years before she held a mop, Ruth had held something else, a stretcher on the battlefields of Iraq. She had been a combat medic, racing against time, stitching together torn bodies with trembling fingers under mortar fire. She had watched brothers in arms bleed out in her lap, whispering last words she still carried in her chest. When she came home, there were no parades. Only bills, grief, and a job offer that felt more like exile than employment. But she never broke. She rose every morning before dawn, tied her headscarf, and stepped into the halls of privilege. She scrubbed marble floors for boys who would inherit fortunes, emptied trash cans for girls who would never know hunger. And though no one thanked her, she carried herself with a dignity they could not touch. Every scar, every night of silence, every funeral folded into her bones had taught her one thing. The world may strip you of medals, respect, even your name, but it cannot strip you of discipline. That day in the hallway, Adrian's shame burned so hot he nearly tore the paper in half. He wanted to vanish into the lockers. Instead, Ruth's eyes brushed his for a second longer than usual. She said nothing, she rarely did. But something in her gaze felt different. It wasn't pity. Pity was cheap and fleeting. It wasn't judgment. He had enough of that already. It was recognition. And recognition was dangerous. Because it meant his suffering was visible. Adrian stuffed the paper into his bag and stormed off. But the silence Ruth left behind clung to him tighter than the laughter of his peers. It was weeks before their paths crossed again in a way that mattered. Adrian kept failing. Math, science, history. His father's fury grew colder. "You're an embarrassment," William Locke spat one evening. "Do you know what men your age are accomplishing while you sit there, wallowing in mediocrity?" Adrian said nothing. Words would not build the bridge he needed. He was drowning in silence of his own. One night, unable to sleep, he wandered the empty halls of the school. That's when he found her, alone, mopping the floor under the flickering light of a dying bulb. She didn't startle when he appeared. She simply kept working, her movements rhythmic, deliberate, like a ritual. "Why do you care so much?" he blurted suddenly. She paused. The mop stilled. Slowly she looked at him. "Care about what?" "About this. About mopping floors. No one notices. No one thanks you." She studied him for a moment that stretched into eternity. Then she spoke words that would anchor themselves in his soul. "Because discipline is not about who sees you. It's about who you become when no one does." The words cracked something open in Adrian. For the first time, someone wasn't telling him what he owed his father, what he owed his family name. She was telling him what he owed himself. Ruth never offered tutoring. She wasn't a teacher in the traditional sense. Instead, she began sharing fragments of her own discipline with Adrian. She told him about soldiers who studied manuals under candlelight, who memorized medical procedures until their hands moved without thought, who drilled until exhaustion became second nature. She spoke of focus forged in chaos, of calm amid gunfire, of learning not for grades but for survival. And then she gave him her secret. "You don't need to be the smartest, Adrian. You need to be the most relentless." From that day, Adrian studied differently. He stopped measuring himself against his classmates and instead against yesterday's version of himself. Ruth would find him in the library long after curfew, whispering equations under his breath, breaking problems into pieces, repeating them until they stuck. Failure no longer meant the end. It meant the next step. But change invites resistance. His teachers scoffed at first. "Locke finally pretending to care?" they muttered. His classmates mocked his sudden seriousness. Even his father dismissed it. "You're grasping at straws." And yet, Ruth's silence became his shield. Each insult glanced off him, each failure became fuel. She never cheered, never coddled, never excused. But sometimes, as she passed him in the hallway, she gave the faintest nod, small enough to miss, powerful enough to move mountains. Still, tension built. A public reckoning was inevitable. It came during finals. Adrian sat in the exam hall, sweat beading on his forehead. Questions sprawled before him like an army waiting to crush him. Whispers filled the air. "He'll fail again. He always does." Adrian's hands trembled. His mind screamed. And then, from the corner of his eye, he saw movement through the glass window in the hallway. Ruth, pushing her mop bucket, head held high. She didn't look at him. She didn't need to. Her words echoed. "Discipline is what you do when no one is watching." And Adrian's breathing slowed. He picked up his pen. He fought not against the test, but against the old self that had already surrendered. When the results came weeks later, silence swept the hallway. For the first time, Adrian's paper bore a grade that wasn't red with failure, it was bold with triumph. Not perfect, but earned. His classmates gawked. His teachers blinked. Even his father faltered. But Adrian didn't look for their approval. His eyes sought only Ruth's. She stood at the end of the hall, mop in hand, expression unreadable. Then, slowly, she gave him that same small nod. And that was enough. That day, Adrian found himself whispering words he would carry forever. Respect is not inherited. It's earned in silence. And later, when his father demanded to know who had helped him, Adrian replied with quiet steel. "Not a tutor. A soldier who mops floors." Word spread. Teachers spoke of his transformation. Students began to glance twice at the janitor, suddenly aware that the woman they had overlooked carried battles greater than their own. One afternoon, Adrian walked beside Ruth down the hall, and no one laughed. Instead, silence filled the air, not mocking silence, but reverent. It was as if the entire school finally stood still, acknowledging a truth they had ignored, that dignity, honor, and discipline can live in the humblest of uniforms. Adrian never became the genius his father wanted. He became something far more dangerous, resilient. And years later, When he built his own path, he credited not wealth, not bloodline, but the janitor who taught him the one secret money could never buy: discipline without audience. And Ruth? She never asked for recognition. She simply kept pushing her mop, head high, as the world slowly learned to bow, not to her job, but to her dignity. Sometimes the greatest teachers don't stand at podiums. They mop floors. They serve silently. They carry scars the world will never see. This story is a reminder: respect is owed not to wealth, but to sacrifice, to discipline, to silent honor. Where are you watching this from? Share your thoughts below, and let us know if you've ever met someone whose silent strength changed your life. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories that honor the unseen heroes among us.